In this video, I want to go through 3 methods for getting the last value for a given row. I've selected the cell I want to extract, and you'll notice that in this case I have nulls, which is going to be a problem. In method 1, I'll use the CountA method, which counts the number of cells that have values in order to get the most recent value. This will work in row 3 because there are no nulls. Start by using CountA, which counts the cells that are not empty, and then simply select the whole range, and then we can copy the function down. And that will give 3 in all cases, because I have the nulls. We can then use index to convert this number into a lookup by saying this is my array, and the row I want is then 1, because I want the current row that I've selected, and my column is then my lookup in the CountA. And we can then see, because I have a null, it's going to return the number 0 instead of the actual null, even though it's actually empty, because that's just how index works. If we select the range, we can see it converts nulls into 0, and then it does that lookup. So this is actually wrong, but this method doesn't work anyway if you have nulls. Meaning again, this method only works if you can confirm you have no blanks. For the next method, we want to use match to do a lookup on the array itself, which sounds funky. It's going to make sense by splitting the calculation into multiple steps. This method will work if you have nulls, like in this example, but it won't work if you have the same value multiple times. Later I'll change this B to an A and we can see that it fails. I'm going to use row 1 as my example while I work through the steps of the function. I want to do a match where I take the entire array, which means I'll do one lookup at a time, and then my lookup array is then the array itself, and I want to do an exact match. And this is going to be a CSE-expression, meaning I have to hold down Control, Shift, and press Enter. This is going to give me a 1. Actually, I needed to select the whole array first before I hit CSE. And this is a CSE expression because I don't have Excel 365. In that, this would be a spill function, which means you write it in the first cell and it would spill to the other cells. Meaning this function will work in older versions of Excel. It can't do a lookup of nothing because that doesn't make sense. And I want to convert this NA error into nothing because my next function will have a problem with errors. The next step is also an array function, which means I'll remember to highlight all the cells first. I want to remove the blanks, which means I can actually copy this function instead. And then I'm going to wrap it in if error. And if error can handle arrays, which is nice. And I'm simply going to output a 0. Now this could be a problem depending on your data set. You'd need to select a value that won't show up in your data. And then because it's a CSE expression, I need to hold down Control Shift and press Enter. Now my errors are simply in zeros. Because I do a lookup on the array itself, and because all of my values in the first row are different, that means I can grab the maximum value from this calculation in order to find the most recent value. But I want to copy this function because we're expanding on it. I want to do max on array, and this spills out an array. See, by highlighting it, highlighting the range and then putting your mouse over the area will show you the array and helps when you don't have Excel 365. I can then do max, and I'm going to repeat the reason why I need to do if error is that max doesn't play well with errors. But max now acts on an array, which gives me 4, and actually it gives 0 because I also need to wrap this in a CSE expression. We can then use index to look up using this value and say I want to do an index on this array. And my row number is still 1 because I want to do a lookup in the row, and my column number is then my expression. And then CSE, which gives me D. And again, this works only because all my values are unique. If I change this into an A, it's going to give me C, because when I do this lookup, we can see here it returns 1, because the way match works is it's going to return the first match, meaning this A will return 1 because it finds A in the first position. If I change this to a B, I will still get that as my value, because even though B is less than C, that's not what the function does. This part converts the value into the index position. Which means to iterate, we can have blanks and we can have values that decrement, but the last value must be unique. The last function is going to use the aggregate function, which is basically irrelevant in new Excel because it simply handles array functions. In the second version, I had to keep using CSE, which I will forget. You already saw that happen. The benefit of aggregate is you don't have to do that. And you can also specify that it ignores errors, which means we can remove the if error part. The function is basically the same, but I'll still work through it one step at a time to make it easier to understand. I first want to grab the helper documentation for the aggregate function because it's not something you use often. The function takes a function and then options And in my case, I don't want to use the max function because that has problems with errors. What I can do instead is to use the large function and then say I want to grab the number 1 largest value. And for options, I can say I want option 6 to ignore errors, which simply removes the if error step. I want to write 14 for the function large, which means we can see here in k, I need to specify 1. And my options are to ignore errors. And then my array is the match function I did before, where my lookup value is still the entire array. And I'm still doing a lookup inside the entire array. Match is still exact. And then I want to grab the number 1 largest value. And this is then going to grab, yeah, it would help if I wrote 14 instead of 1. The problem came from average, and just to show it, if we have errors in my array, which is what I have here, where I'm using max, it's going to error out because max can't handle errors. And actually, if we use F9 to turn this into the array, we can see what happens. It still spits out value because there are errors, but that's the point of using 14 instead. The large method doesn't care. Lastly, we need to wrap this in index in order to convert 4 into the lookup. So I want to say index, and my array is then still the entire row, and my row is still 1, and I'm going to do a line break because aggregate is a bit weird, and then the closing parentheses. And then we get B, and I don't have to use CSE, which is nice. As said in the comments, it doesn't care about blanks, and you don't have to increment the values because B is less than C. It only looks at the position in the array, but you need the last value to be unique. But in this case, if I turn the B into an A, it's going to return C, because again, when you do the match, it's going to find the first match, which is then 1, which means this array becomes 1, 2, 1, and 2 is the largest value. So as long as you can guarantee that the last value is unique, then this is a superior method, because it handles errors innately, and you don't have to use CSE. So